Hello, welcome back once again to another episode of The Swift Half with Snowdon. With me, Christopher Snowdon. Hope you're well. I am very excited to be joined this week by the author and Spectator columnist Lionel Shriver. I enjoy her column every fortnight, I think it is, in The Spectator. It gets involved with lots of very interesting and often controversial issues. Lionel, hi, how are you doing? Thank you for joining us.
I'm great, and it's a pleasure.
I don't know where to start. As I say, you touch on all sorts of different issues in The Spectator. I wondered, do you feel you've in some way been sort of dragged into these culture wars that everyone keeps talking about? I remember, I don't know how many years ago it was, you got in trouble for wearing a sombrero on the basis of cultural appropriation and so on. And since then, you seem in many ways a kind of an unlikely person to be dragged into all this kind of stuff. Is it because you've changed, or has the world changed?
I don't think I've changed. The world has certainly changed. I wouldn't categorize myself as having been dragged into anything. I mean, I have only myself to blame for this. I'm just interested in a lot of matters. I've always been a big newspaper reader. I keep up with the news. I shout at the television a lot. It's just a matter of having been given the opportunity. So, Fraser Nelson offered me the Spectator column in 2017. That would have been a year after I, disgraced myself by wearing a hat. And I said, yes, why not? It's a great forum and I enjoy the magazine. So, no, I mean, I haven't been unwillingly drafted. And I have some appreciation for the fact that I have plenty of fiction writing colleagues who don't want to have anything to do with political commentary, who just want to work on their books and be left alone. And so I don't regard being a participant in public discourse as a requirement of my occupation. It's my choice.
Absolutely. And one of the things you've written quite a bit about is free speech, which makes sense, of course, in your profession. And I know you've written about Dave Chappelle a little while ago.
Mm-hmm.
I wondered if I could get your thoughts on the fairly recent Jimmy Carr joke that Nadeem Doris has said might cause her to start censoring YouTube. Sorry, not YouTube, Netflix, if she gets a chance.
I mean, are your listeners familiar with the joke?
Probably. I think most people are by now. I should explain. This is the Holocaust joke. Sometimes people put the word joke in italics and explain that they don't think it's funny. But the gist of the joke is he says that a lot of people don't realize that lots of gypsies were killed in concentration camps, and leaves a pause, misdirection, and then says that's because people never want to talk about the positives. So that's the joke, whether you find it funny or not.
I thought the joke was that's the upside of the Holocaust.
Right, that was it. Yeah, he says that people don't talk about the gypsies being killed because people never want to talk about the positives. My delivery is not as good as Carr's, hence our different occupations.
You buried the.
Oh, sorry. There you go.
You buried the punchline. Look, it's a tasteless joke. Okay. It's only moderately funny, like not super funny. And a lot of jokes get criticized as being horrific, partly because they're not funny enough. And by contrast, Dave Chappelle is hilarious. So he is tasteless beyond belief, but he's got good comic judgment. And that's one way you get away with it. The other way you get away with it is being Black. It's useful. And by the way, I should say that I'm big on that. I want Black comedians to take advantage of their implicit permission as much as possible. That's some of the last comedy out there that's genuinely funny. So please go to town. Carr doesn't doesn't have that racial permission. I'm not big on banning anything unless it's absolutely necessary. And least of all do I want to ban tastelessness or poorly executed humor. I mean, we can just say, well, that's tasteless and move on. We don't have to have some kind of paroxysm. It's not that important.
Yeah, well, I absolutely agree. And I mean, I find it kind of weird that people were debating whether it was funny or not. It certainly wasn't funny the way I told it. And maybe I should be banned for it. But it seems to me irrelevant. You know, I mean, it's not a matter of scorecard for humor. It's a matter of free speech. And there are quite a few sick comedians, if you want to call them that, and Jimmy Carr's absolutely made a name for himself as being a teller of sick jokes. The show was called His Dark Material. Personally, I didn't find it very funny in the context of like a tweet, which is how I saw it. I saw it clipped out. I'll probably go off and watch the entire thing on Netflix now, which is, I guess, an unintended consequence of this palaver.
Well, that's really punishing yourself.
Maybe it'd be funnier in context. I do think, generally speaking,
the issue really, it's a legal one. It's a free speech one, and we have to extend free speech to rubbish comedians and to off-color jokes. I mean, because if you say you can only tell a joke that's funny, then that's a subjective judgment and completely unenforceable, or its enforcement would be a free speech nightmare. And you cannot, I don't want special protections, like of the sort that the British government embraces to be imposed on artists and comedians. I don't believe in these so-called protected characteristics, full stop. I'm very attached to the American concept of equal treatment under the law. So and I think that's a cornerstone of democratic due process, that you don't pass laws that specially apply to one group and not another. And Britain has run roughshod over that principle. So, I just across the board, we have to have permission to be bad at our jobs and to make remarks that some people are going to find in poor taste.
And you wouldn't draw the line anywhere, essentially, when it comes to free speech, or you draw it just at libel and threats to kill, the traditional.
Yeah, I do, and because I think that the danger that we face is not so much people going to town with their terrifying freedoms and saying mean things. I am much more frightened of control of free speech. The powers that be in all kinds of spheres, including government, like nothing better than to have all these different exceptions so that they can exercise control. And where free speech has gone off the rails is not in democracies where people are too free to say what they want. It's in places like China where they can't. That's what frightens me. It's authoritarianism, not libertarianism.
Have you been following the, I think it's called the Online Harms Bill, making its way through Parliament very slowly? This is the government's attempt to censor not just like tweets and YouTube and things, but actually direct messages between people, as I understand it.
Yeah, it's still a work in progress, so I don't know all the details. And I admit I was a little slow on the uptake in realizing how important this is. And of course, it's being sold as a protective measure to prevent, the encouragement of suicide and self-harm, and that seems all very laudable. But it's being written in such a way that the powers would be much broader. And yes, it's as I understand it, it is going to be a serious threat to free speech unless it is revised.
The sinister phrase in it, I think, is legal but harmful. So the government wants to stop these big tech companies from allowing anyone to say things that are legal but harmful.
Yeah,
And of course,
well, harmful is,
down to
again,
this.
a subjective judgment, right? So I could say, I don't like the color of the wall behind you. I wouldn't have chosen that color. I find it a little loud. It's harming me. You know, you can say anything is harmful.
Right. Whatever happened to sticks and stones, you know? To switch to a different topic, you've written a lot about the COVID regulations and the lockdowns and so on over the course of the last 2 years. How do you feel about what's been going on in Canada, also to a lesser extent New Zealand, and Holland actually a couple of months ago, where you're seeing a lot of frustration now from people and some extraordinary reactions from the government in Canada, at least, where kind of these emergency powers are being used for the first time. What's your take on this, and where's it going to end?
Well, of course, I don't know the answer to the last question.
Where's it going to end?
I mean, it won't surprise you that I'm very encouraged by these protests, and my main question is, what took them so long? I mean, it's been 2 years of authoritarian overreach all across the West, and I've been shocked by the almost universal passivity of the populations all these regulations have been imposed on. So I think it's a sign of psychic and political health that there's finally some pushback.
Do you think
the response, of course, has been discouraging, and especially in Canada right now, this business of invoking emergency powers, and which include the ability to seize your bank account, and also to seize or freeze crowdfunding sites, which have generously funded these protests. I mean, this is, well, authoritarian doesn't begin to say it. This is rule by decree, and it's illiberal in the extreme. And I'm afraid it's just another example of how the so-called liberals of yesterday have become the quasi-fascists of today. And they don't believe in freedom. They only believe in instituting freedom to say what they already believe. Trudeau has been very supportive of all of protests and even quite violent arson attacks when it seemed as if there was this grave of Indigenous children that had been secretly buried. And I think that whole story has been debunked. But multiple Christian churches Catholic churches were burnt down, and Trudeau was very understanding about that. And he was very supportive of the farmers who were protesting Modi's agricultural laws, and they were blocking traffic and bringing cities to a halt. And he thought that was great. But when it's protesters in his own country who are protesting his policies, suddenly it's unacceptable and they're terrorists. And I think it's been really shameful the way he has tried to smear people who are clearly out to protest vaccine mandates, not even vaccines, but vaccine mandates. And he calls them Nazis and claims that they're all flying swastikas and Confederate flags. And okay, it's a very large movement. If you look really hard on the fringes, you can find someone carrying a little Confederate flag, but that is not the purpose of the protest. And I read a shocking figure this morning. Apparently, 57% of Canadians have successfully been convinced that these protests are not about vaccines or even, or vaccine, much less vaccine mandates. But that's just a bunch of right-wing people expressing a disgruntlement and white supremacy. And it's appalling.
I agree. Do you think have we been bounced into lockdown before Christmas, as quite a few people were hoping for? Do you think we would have seen the same kind of protests in Britain, or do you think we're just too compliant?
I hate to say it, but yes, you're too compliant. No, you wouldn't have seen any protests. I have been so disappointed in this country. It is a very law-abiding country. It's a culture that has a lot of commitment to the whole idea of rules. The British like rules, and temperamentally and philosophically, it's one of my biggest departures from the people I live among, generally happily. I follow rules because I think they're good rules, or I follow them because otherwise I'm going to get in trouble. I can behave in a fearful way as much as anyone else, but I never follow rules because they are rules. There have been a lot of bad laws passed. It used to be illegal to be homosexual. Let's not forget that was a bad law. So there's no reason to follow laws because there are laws, but there's just an obedient streak in the British.
Have you been out on any
I
of the
don't
protests
share.
yourself? Have you been out in any of the lockdown protests yourself over the last year or so?
No, I haven't, and I admit that I'm just too lazy. But I feel that in my journalism, I've done my part.
I want to kick on to another subject. We've only got half an hour. It's a totally different subject, which is vaping. I saw an article from you about 8 years ago in, I think it was The Guardian, a pro-vaping.
Back when they published me.
Back when they published you, yeah. And I wondered if you were still a vapor, what your thoughts were about vaping, but also in particular, if you've been keeping abreast of what's been happening with vaping, particularly in America. Because whilst here in the UK, we have government and public health agencies that are, broadly speaking, pretty pro-vaping, that is certainly not true in America, or indeed large parts of the world. In fact, things are going backwards in terms of just general public's understanding of the relative risks. So we had Public Health England saying that e-cigarettes are at least 95% safer than smoking, whereas in America 10 years ago, people actually had a relatively good idea of what the risks were. They just assumed that vaping was a lot safer than smoking, and they were right, even if they didn't have any evidence to hand. But now, the figures are quite shocking. Something like 65% of people in America think that vaping is either as dangerous or more dangerous than smoking, and that's a big rise on even a few years ago. So I don't know if you. Well, I'll ask you a few questions. Are you still enjoying vaping, and have you been following the politics of it?
Yes, I'm still enjoying it. I'm especially grateful for the technology because my husband was a smoker since he was 19, a pretty heavy smoker, and it made me fear for widowhood. Honestly, I want him to stick around, and when he started vaping, it took him 2 weeks to give up tobacco, and he's never had any since. And that's miraculous. And so I feel that I may have won for myself several more years of married life. And that's not a small debt to a simple technology. And I spent a certain amount of time in the States, and therefore I know what's been going on. It's not some kind of weird, miasma of ignorance that's just infected the US population. in their imagining that vaping is dangerous, or even more so than smoking tobacco. It has been a concerted campaign, and I honestly think there's an element of the punitive here. When vaping came along, it enraged the anti-tobacco lobby. And this is a fanatical lobby. No restriction is severe enough. They tried to bring in laws to keep you from smoking on your own balcony or even in your own apartment, and on beaches and in the middle of the wilderness, where the chance of harming anyone else with passive smoke is immeasurably wee, right? So these people are completely nuts. And then along came vaping, and it made it possible for smokers to no longer get all those horrible health consequences that justify all this fanaticism. I mean, it is because smoking tobacco causes cancer. And then suddenly they weren't getting cancer causing toxicity, and they were still having fun. They were still enjoying themselves. They were still having the smoking experience. And so that they could stop smoking tobacco and still have that enjoyment, the pleasure of having nicotine taken into your lungs. Because one of the things that is under advertised is that nicotine is not a dangerous drug. It is what makes you addicted to tobacco, but it is not in and of itself a harmful substance. And the tobacco lobby just hated this, and went out to squelch it, because you're not supposed to enjoy yourself when you quit smoking. It's supposed to be horrible.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, people often ask me why so many countries have gone nuts about it, or so many public health bodies have gone nuts about it, and that's largely the answer I give. I think there's a huge level of basic puritanism to it. I also think there's an element that these guys had their plan, that they were going to stamp out tobacco one bit at a time, each bit probably more painful than the last, but they would get there in the end and then achieve prohibition and e-cigarettes and other reduced nicotine.
This is one of their favorite arguments. It's not an argument, actually. It's pathetic. We don't want to re-normalize smoking. Well, nobody's re-normalizing smoking tobacco. The cigarette is a very different thing. I mean, this doesn't even look like a cigarette. And in fact, I think one of the smartest things that the vaping industry did was to stop making them look like cigarettes. They're the very early ones. You'll remember they even made them white with orange.
They were rubbish. The reason they changed that is because they just didn't have the firepower.
Well, they didn't work. They were, as you say, they were rubbish. So the technology changed. It's not the same thing. So it doesn't renormalize smoking at all. And I just think that it was a technology that came along that was inconvenient for a lobby that has in itself become its own little industry.
Yeah.
And it upset the apple cart. And there's really no reason you shouldn't be able to vape on planes, for example, but you can't. When vaping first came in the UK, you used to be able to use them in restaurants. Do you remember that? Restaurants and bars?
Yeah, there were no rules anywhere.
Right. I'm a little curious. I haven't kept up with this, but is there any law against vaping in restaurants and bars? A law? Or is this just the establishments deciding that it upsets the customers?
There's no limit on where you can vape anywhere in the UK whatsoever. It's purely private train companies, private restaurants, private cinemas just saying. The thing that annoys me is that you get these signs saying no smoking, including e-cigarettes.
Yeah.
Now, I wouldn't mind so much if they said no smoking and also no vaping. It's the idea that you smoke an e-cigarette, which I find annoying. If you get told off, you can't smoke that in here, sir. I'm not smoking, it's vaping.
Yeah.
Totally different. I know it's only a word, but yeah, these things matter because they are totally different.
Well,
But
most
it's a big
importantly,
problem.
there is zero evidence that vaping causes secondary vapor problems, that you're hurting someone else who
Absolutely, yeah.
inhales a little bit of your vapor.
You do get
It's
people, to be
like
fair, you do
inhaling a
get people who
cloud.
puff out huge clouds of it, and that can be kind of annoying if it stinks of blackcurrant and so on. Usually they're the ones that actually don't include nicotine, funnily enough. So
Huh.
you can inhale a huge amount and then exhale a huge amount like some kind of dragon. They can be kind of antisocial. I think probably those people can be dealt with without
Yeah,
resorting
I
to
mean,
criminal
I am a
law,
little sympathetic with people who don't want to smell, you know,
apple
pina
and whatnot.
colada
Yeah.
while they're eating sushi or something.
Are you aware of Michael Bloomberg's role in all this anti-vaping hysteria worldwide?
Oh, he's one of the culprits.
I mean, he spent an unbelievable amount of
And
money.
also Bill de Blasio, who made
Yeah,
it
but
illegal to buy flavors at
yeah,
all in New York City. You can only
yeah.
buy tobacco flavor.
Well, Bloomberg himself has put in $120 million worldwide just on the campaign for banning flavors, let alone anything else, let alone all the money he's put in for soda taxes and other e-cigarette restrictions. $120 million goes a long way in public
Yeah,
health advocacy. And you can
you can
see that
produce a lot of
effect.
propaganda with that,
Absolutely, yeah.
and
It's
lies.
really scandalous, yeah. And it's lies that have led to, as I say, even in England, people's knowledge has gone backwards on e-cigarettes. And funnily enough, you mentioned nicotine before. It doesn't seem to be widely known that nicotine is effectively safe insofar as it doesn't cause any diseases. Even if you do surveys of doctors, and this has been true all around the world for a long, long time, most doctors think that nicotine causes cancer.
Really.
So if you've got doctors who believe that, what hope for everybody else? I want to switch to one final subject because I think we're close to being out of time. I saw your trigonometry interview a year or two ago, and I've been on that show myself. And I know at the end they ask, what is it we're not talking about that we should talk about more? And you said overpopulation, which piqued my interest.
Mm.
Can you elaborate?
Oh, well, I'm an amateur demographer. I have been most of my life. It's one of my favorite subjects. In fact, I just
Are you a
did.
Malthusian demographer?
No, I wouldn't go that far in that Malthus has been widely discredited, but I am concerned about rapid population growth, and I think it exacerbates a lot of problems, some environmental, some social. And I just reviewed a book about African demography that comes out in this week's Spectator, which addresses the fact that African population is about to double by 2050 and is likely to be over 4 billion people by the end of the century. And that will be 40% of all the people alive in the world.
And can
And
Africa sustain
that
that?
has clear implications for Europe, because I don't think that that continent has the water, if nothing else, to support 4 billion people. I mean, after all, that's more than half the people who are alive today, all over the world.
Yeah, I mean,
So there are a lot of social implications that the immigration from Africa is likely to be staggering.
Particularly with climate change and stuff, I guess, if that's all going to make things
Well, that
much
will be an
hotter.
accelerant.
I mean, I do share your concerns with this, and of course, you've already mentioned Malthus being debunked, and the fears about population growth have, of course, so far always not turned out to be correct, and largely that's because of improvements in technology, golden rice, GM crops, and improvements in farming and so on. I have no idea what population the world can sustain. I guess nobody does, but presumably there is some kind of limit, and there's got to be some kind of optimal limit. So I do share your worries with that, but I mean, what's the solution? Is there one? Economic development?
I would advocate more provision of birth control to women who want it. There isn't an easy solution, especially if we're going to talk about Africa. So far, even increased development or urbanization has not significantly brought down the number of children that African couples want.
Right.
Okay, so it's not just a matter of having lots more children because nobody has access to condoms or something. It's you know, if you ask African women in Nigeria, for example, how many kids they want, it's between 5 and 6, and that has not significantly changed. And that's, you know, it's fascinating, actually. We've just assumed that everyone all cultures are the same, and they will follow the West's lead. And as countries develop, their birth rates are going to plummet. And it turns out that Africa's quite different, and it's cultural. They want large families, and are not necessarily going to change their mind if they live in a city or make a little more money.
Do you think, I mean, you may well be right. Do you think it is cultural, or is it just that, you know, the pace of economic growth has happened so quickly in these countries compared to, you know, where we were 150 years ago?
It hasn't been that fast.
Well, but infant mortality rates, I guess, have dropped. I mean, people say they want 5
infant mortality rates dropped in these countries a long time ago. A long time ago.
They're not saying they want 5.
And it has always been assumed that, oh, then, you know, you realize that when you have children that they are going to live to adulthood, and then at least by the next generation, the culture changes, and it's not happening in Africa. I mean, it's really interesting. And I hope I don't sound judgmental, because I don't feel judgmental. If anything, I feel a little guilty that I have not had any children. And if everyone were like me, then we would disappear in a couple generations. So I haven't done my part.
You've done your part.
And you have to, you know, the truth is that in some respects, Africa's getting ready to take over the world. If you are willing to raise, it's a lot of work raising children. Okay, so if you're willing to raise large families, generation after generation, then you rule the world. I mean, one of the most interesting aspects of the book I just read, he mentions this in passing, but thanks to the one-child policy, and even its lifting not making much difference because the Chinese are very ambitious for their children and often just want one, China is set to go from a peak of 1.5 billion to 500 million.
Really?
At the end of the century. It's already almost 1.5, right? And so then it's going to start shrinking, and then it's going to shrink really fast. And they're going to have huge labor force problems. They're going to have a huge elderly cohort, even larger than in the West. That's what's going to check Chinese power, is demographics. Now, can you understand why I'm so interested in this field?
Absolutely. Well, it's a very interesting
great
field.
It explains practically everything.
Well, I will look forward to reading your review in The Spectator this week. That's all.
It takes a lot less time to read my review than to read the 400-page
I may well read the book if you lure me in with your review. Look, Lionel, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I could talk to you for much longer, but it's only a half-hour show. Thanks very much for sparing your time. Thank you very much for watching at home. You know the drill. If you want to give us any money, you are more than welcome to iea.org.uk/donate. And if you want to give money to our digital stuff like this, it's patreon.com/IEA London. I will be back with another guest in a couple of weeks' time for another half-hour chat. Thank you and goodbye.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.